Okay, so you want to bring Matthew 7, 1 to 6 to life for your congregation or study group, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you already know the verses, but you're looking for those fresh angles, the illustrations that make people go, whoa, I never thought of it like that. We've got you covered.
You've come to the right place. We dug into commentaries and sermons from pastors all over, and you're not going to believe some of the approaches they take.
Right. I'm intrigued. Hit me with it.
Well, the speck and log analogy is obviously a classic for a reason, right?
Yeah.
But one pastor told this hilarious story about frantically searching for children's cold medicine,
Oh, yeah.
only to realize it was right there the whole time, blind to the obvious.
Right.
His point. We often miss the obvious in our own lives, just like the guy with the plank in his eye.
That's a great illustration. It's so relatable, especially for parents.
Exactly. And it really drives home the point that we need to be more aware of our own faults before we start judging others.
Now, you said there were some really unique takes on this passage. What else did you find?
Get this, one pastor actually used a Progressive insurance commercial to illustrate the verse.
What?
Yeah, he talked about how we're quick to assign blame, just like those folks in the ads who are always trying to shift responsibility for accidents.
That's surprising. How did he tie that back to Matthew 7, 1 to 6?
Well, he argued that, just like in those commercials, we often focus on pointing fingers instead of taking responsibility for our own actions. It's a clever way to connect with a modern audience and make the message relevant.
I like that. It's unexpected, but it makes sense.
And it challenges us to think about how often we try to deflect blame instead of looking inward.
Speaking of looking inward, another pastor completely flipped the script on the whole logless church concept.
Right. He argued that Jesus isn't after a church with no faults.
Yeah.
He wants a speckless church, meaning we're focused on helping each other become pure, not on being perfect right now. It's a subtle but significant shift in perspective.
Interesting. So it's not about pretending we have it all together, but about striving for holiness together, supporting each other in the process.
Precisely. It's a much more realistic and hopeful view of the church.
Okay, so we've got some great illustrations and a new perspective on what it means to be a speckless church. Anything else that stood out?
Well, one pastor posed this really thought-provoking question. What if, instead of focusing on avoiding judgment, we focused on becoming people who judge righteously?
It's intriguing. What does he mean by judging righteously?
He suggested that judging righteously means judging with love, humility, and a desire for restoration, not condemnation. It's about helping people see their blind spots so they can grow and change.
So it's not about never judging, but about judging in a way that reflects God's character. That's challenging.
It definitely is. And it requires us to be willing to examine our own hearts and motives before we offer any kind of judgment.
So how do we even begin to cultivate this kind of righteous judgment?
That's where understanding the historical context becomes crucial. Remember, Jesus was addressing the Pharisees, who were known for their judgmental attitudes.
Right. They were very focused on outward appearances and strict adherence to the law.
Exactly. So when Jesus says, judge not, that you be not judged, he's directly challenging their hypocrisy and legalism.
So it's not just a general statement about avoiding judgment, but a specific call to examine our hearts and motives, especially when we're tempted to judge others based on superficial criteria.
Precisely. And that's a message that's just as relevant today as it was in Jesus's time.
Absolutely. We're still prone to judge others based on appearances, social media posts, political affiliations. The list goes on.
And that's why it's so important to remember the context of this passage and to apply it to our own lives with wisdom and discernment.
It seems like understanding the historical context really helps us grasp the depth and nuance of Jesus' word.
Absolutely. It's not just a simple command to don't judge. It's a call to self-reflection, discernment, and righteous living.
Okay, so we've got some fresh sermon illustrations, a new perspective on being a speckless church, and a deeper understanding of the historical context. What else did these pastors have to say about Matthew 7, 1 to 6?
Well, this is where things get really interesting. One pastor dove into that often overlooked part of the passage about not giving what is sacred to dogs or throwing pearls to pigs.
Ooh, that's a tough one. A lot of people struggle with what that even means.
Right. It's a powerful metaphor that can be interpreted in many ways. Some pastors see it as a warning against sharing the gospel with those who are clearly not receptive. Like, don't waste your time on people who are going to mock or reject the message.
Okay, I can see that. It's about being discerning with our evangelism. But doesn't that contradict the idea of sharing the gospel with everyone?
That's a great question. It all boils down to discernment, right? This pastor wasn't advocating for never sharing the gospel. Instead, he was cautioning against throwing pearls before swine, so to speak.
Interesting. So it's not about withholding the truth, but about recognizing when someone is genuinely open to hearing it versus when they're just going to trample on it.
Exactly. Think about it. You wouldn't entrust your most prized possession to someone who didn't value it, would you?
No, absolutely no. I guess it's the same with spiritual truths. We need to be careful who we share them with.
Right. Other pastors interpret this verse more broadly as a call to discernment in all our relationships,
I mean,
meaning we need to be wise about who we share our deepest thoughts and feelings with. Not everyone is worthy of our trust and vulnerability.
so it's not just about evangelism, but about protecting our hearts in all our interactions.
Exactly. There are times when stepping back and protecting ourselves is the kindest thing we can do, both for ourselves and for the other person.
That's a tough lesson to learn. But I see how it ties into the overall theme of discernment that we've been talking about.
It all circles back to that, doesn't it? Discernment in how we judge and how we share the gospel and how we choose our confidants. It's a thread that runs throughout Matthew 7, 1-6.
Wow, that's insightful. I hadn't thought about it that way before. So what you're saying is that this passage isn't just about avoiding judgment. It's also about discerning when to speak, when to hold back, and who to trust with our most vulnerable selves.
That's a great way to put it.
You know, as we're talking about these different interpretations, I'm struck by how personal some of these sermons were. It seems like a lot of pastors use their own experiences to illustrate the points.
You're right. That definitely stood out to me, too. There was the pastor who shared the story about searching for the cold medicine, the one who used the Progressive commercial, and another pastor spoke about a time when his family was harshly critiquing a church service they'd attended.
What was his point in sharing that story?
He wanted to show how easy it is to fall into the trap of judgment, even in seemingly harmless situations. He talked about how his kids were nitpicking every little detail of the service and how he had to gently remind them to focus on the bigger picture.
That's a great example. It's something we can all relate to.
Exactly. It's a reminder that we need to be mindful of our own judgments, even in seemingly insignificant matters. And it's a great reminder to preach with authenticity.
I agree. Those personal stories really helped bring the message to life. They made it feel more relatable and authentic. Is there anything else we should consider when preparing to teach on this passage?
There's one more thing that several pastors emphasized, and it's something that can really enrich your understanding of Matthew 7, 1-6, the importance of cross-referencing other parts of the Bible.
Okay, that's interesting. Why is cross-referencing so crucial in this case?
Because it helps us to understand the passage in its full context. It's not just an isolated verse floating out there on its own. It's connected to a larger narrative.
I see. So by looking at other verses that deal with judgment, we can get a more holistic understanding of what Jesus is saying here.
Exactly. For instance, one pastor referenced 2 Timothy 4 and Revelation 19 to emphasize that Jesus is the ultimate judge.
Right, because in Matthew 7, 1-6, Jesus is talking about our human judgment, not God's final judgment. It's helpful to see the distinction there.
Another pastor referenced Romans 14 and James 4, cautioning against judging others in matters of personal preference or conscience.
That makes sense because those passages are all about not judging others for their choices in areas where the Bible doesn't give clear guidance.
Exactly. They provide a helpful framework for understanding the boundaries of our judgment.
Are there any other cross-references that you found particularly insightful?
Well, there was one more that stood out. One pastor pointed to John 7.24, where Jesus tells us not to judge by appearances, but to judge with right judgment.
Okay, so it's not just about avoiding judgment altogether, but about making sure our judgments are based on truth and fairness.
Precisely. And that ties back to the idea of judging righteously, which we talked about earlier.
So this verse actually gives us permission to evaluate things, to use our discernment, but to do it with the right heart and the right motives.
Exactly. And that, of course, requires us to examine our hearts before we judge.
Which takes us back to the very beginning of our conversation. It seems like the whole passage hinges on this idea of self-reflection.
You got it.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, to really understand Matthew 7, 1-6, we need to do more than just read the words on the page. We need to explore its historical context connected to other passages and ultimately apply it to our own lives with humility and discernment.
That's a great summary of everything we've discussed today. It's not just about avoiding judgment. It's about becoming people who judge righteously.
And who share our hearts with wisdom and discernment.
Absolutely. And who are willing to examine our own hearts before we point the finger at others. It's a challenging message, but one that's full of grace and hope.
And one that, when rightly understood, can transform our lives and relationships.
I couldn't agree more. Now, before we wrap things up, I think there's an important point we haven't directly addressed yet. We've talked about the power of personal stories and sermons, but what if that vulnerability itself is the most sacred thing we have to offer?
Now, that's an interesting thought. I'm not sure I follow you. What do you mean by that?
Well, we've talked about how impactful it can be when pastors share their own struggles and insights,
Yeah,
right?
right.
What if we took that a step further and shared our own struggles with judgment?
So instead of just preaching about not judging, we admit that we struggle with it too.
Exactly. What would happen if we were honest about the times we've judged others unfairly, the times we've been quick to point the finger, the times we failed to show grace and compassion?
Hmm, that's a pretty radical idea. I mean, it goes against the grain of how we typically talk about judgment, doesn't it?
It does, but think about the potential impact. It would show our congregations that we're not perfect, that we're all in this together, and it would create a space for honesty and vulnerability.
It would definitely challenge the perception that pastors have it all figured out.
And it would model humility, which is essential for judging righteously.
That's a great point. If we're not willing to admit our own faults, how can we expect others to do the same?
Exactly. So, as you prepare to teach on Matthew 7, 1-6, consider this. What if, instead of just talking about judgment, you shared your own struggles with it? What if you invited your congregation to do the same?
Wow, that could be incredibly powerful. It could transform the way we approach this whole topic.
It could be the start of a deeper, more authentic conversation about judgment in your community. And it could help people find freedom from the burden of judgment, both the judgment they receive from others and the judgment they hold against themselves.
That's a beautiful thought. So to wrap things up, we've taken a deep dive into Matthew 7, 1-6, uncovering fresh perspectives and practical insights to help bring this passage to life.
Remember, it's not just about avoiding judgment. It's about becoming people who judge righteously, share our hearts with wisdom and discernment, and are willing to be vulnerable with each other.
And maybe, just maybe, by sharing our own struggles, we can help others find freedom from the heavy weight of judgment. Thanks for joining us.